Hi, I'm Beth Bennett-Britton. I'm a consultant in public health for Gloucestershire County Council and I lead on the Children and Young People's public health portfolio. I'd like to nominate the fantastic midwifery team at Gloucestershire Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust, and more specifically Vivian Mortimer, Sally Unwin and Michelle Richardson for your pioneering maternity services ACES pilot. The pilot worked with mothers and their partners to understand their ACEs and initiate those important conversations, which led to better care planning and signposting throughout their maternity journey. This is the first pilot of its kind and made an outstanding contribution to addressing childhood adversity, identifying ACEs in families who use maternity and neonatal services, improving the response given and building resilience in the families that needed that support. The project was also unique in the way that it explored not just mothers but also partners' exposure to ACEs, both in the past and in the present. This is important as we recognise that ACEs can have a lasting impact into adulthood, and we're starting to explore the values that an ACE-informed approach can bring to building resilience and improving outcomes for vulnerable adults. Another one of the priorities of Action on ACEs Gloucestershire is to raise awareness and understanding of ACEs within organisations and to embed ACE-informed approaches throughout multi-agency organisational thinking. And this project had an impact not only on those midwives directly involved, but throughout maternity services and, in fact, the hospital, by making midwives more ACE aware. And this new knowledge has been shown in the pilot to have a positive impact on both their personal lives and professional practice. Thank you very much to the team and good luck.
We're really thrilled to receive this award and have our work recognised by Action on ACEs Gloucestershire. It's amazing to receive the Changemaker Award, and I'd really like to thank Action on ACEs Gloucestershire for giving us the inspiration to carry out the project and for their ongoing support. And I think that maternity services are uniquely placed to really make a difference for children and families by preventing ACEs in future generations.
We're really pleased to receive this award from Gloucestershire Action on ACEs. In maternity, it's really helpful if we can identify incidents that have affected families throughout their lives, and particularly adverse childhood experiences. And we know that any family where childhood experiences have been very traumatic, that can have an effect in many different ways on their adult lives. So in maternity and as midwives, we can really help to support those families by identifying the traumas and then managing with support to help prevent future generations experiencing the same sort of traumas. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone at Gloucestershire Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust, most particularly the midwives that supported us with this project. I think the project will make a huge difference to the families that we support both now and in the future. We're looking forward to rolling out the project to more families and more midwives across the county in the hope of addressing some of the impact that ACEs have had on the parents' lives, but also reducing the number of ACEs that the babies are born into within the families. We're hoping this will have a positive impact and improve positive parenting and resilience within the family to empower them to bring their babies up in a nurtured, supportive family environment. Thank you.
I want to begin by telling you my story, how I discovered the importance of a restorative approach in schools and how it can mitigate the adverse effects of the trauma we experience in everyday life. I'm sure you will be able to relate to aspects of my story. It's not unusual, but it can be different. I'm sitting in the staff room of a secondary school in Gloucester in tears. It's the mid-1990s and I'm halfway through my teacher training. I've just taught a Year 8 class and they left the classroom literally covered in clay. Their behaviour escalated really quickly and was out of control, way out of my comfort zone. What bothered me was I didn't know why they were behaving so badly and why they wouldn't listen to me. I didn't know what to do and I had no one around me to ask. At the time I had my own issues with how conflict was being played out in my life and I just couldn't go there. I was terrified of standing up to them and there was no way I was letting them know how their behaviour was affecting me. Brené Brown, a leading researcher in vulnerability and shame, says that staying vulnerable is a risk we have to take if we want to experience connection. But I realised at that moment I didn't want connection. I just wanted to run away. And so run away I did. I completed my teacher training, but I knew I was never going to teach in a mainstream secondary school again. So I began my career as a youth worker. Over the next decade or so, I worked alongside the most vulnerable and often marginalised young people. Young people who seemed to find themselves on the wrong side of the law or the wrong side of the school gate. I also worked with their families and communities who often had a similar tale to tell of their experiences growing up. Whilst working with these young people and their families, many of the services I encountered described them in terms of their needs and their vulnerabilities, and no doubt, had it been more recently, their number of ACEs, but rarely by the strengths and talents that I saw in them. They talked about them like there was something wrong with them, as though there were no hope for them. These kids, they called them. And they told me they were difficult to engage, difficult to teach, and difficult to understand. But they weren't, I thought. They just needed someone to listen to them, to have their feelings validated, and to know that someone cared. Throughout those years, I often thought about that staff room and of my own experience of secondary school. Although I had been an able pupil academically, socially I was ostracised from my peer group. I lived outside the community and I was clever. Clever wasn't cool in my school, so I was never included in the parties or the gatherings at the park. I didn't really have close friends and I spent much of my time on my own. I thought about what had helped me through those years of bullying and isolation, and I remembered Maggie Edwards, my art teacher. Maggie was kind and funny, and she thought I was special, that I had talent. The art room is where I would go when I was scared or felt alone at school. I still remember the smell of the paint, listening to the music and her talking as I sat drawing, calming myself until I felt safe again. Of course I wanted to be an art teacher just like Maggie Edwards when I grew up. But my experiences had taught me that I wasn't like Maggie, and the kids I taught weren't like me. Or were they? Was that why I was being constantly drawn to helping these kids, the ones nobody else wanted to work with, the ones who'd been written off by their families and by their school? Our backgrounds might have been very different, but adversity takes many forms and trauma doesn't discriminate against race or gender or class. And I wanted to make it better for them, to give them a chance and a voice, and I wanted to help their families and their teachers to understand them better. Years later, when I discovered restorative practice, I knew I had found the thing that I wish I'd known all those years ago in the staff room, the thing that could have made it all so different. I realised from the beginning that here was a concept that explicitly described to others what I knew implicitly, that being connected to one another and having positive relationships is key to our well-being, that the language we use creates our reality and the way people make us feel affects us deeply. Having someone who genuinely cares about us makes all the difference. Restorative practice gave me a set of principles to live by, but also a toolkit to teach others how to engage with these kids. Essentially, restorative practice is about relationships, building strong, healthy relationships and repairing them when conflict occurs. It's about taking responsibility for your own behaviour and holding others to account for theirs. Knowing that when conflict occurs, harm is caused on both sides and that we need to repair the harm if the relationship is to survive. This means being given a chance to be listened to and for your story to be properly heard. It also means listening to the other person's perspective to understand why they did what they did. It isn't just about being nice to each other, although kindness is a key component. It's about having respect for each other's opinion, about being curious and not prejudging a person or a situation. I began my journey with restorative practice in Gloucestershire schools in 2016. Our pilot school showed some quick wins around reducing exclusion and increasing attendance, so we started to train a number of other schools across the county. Following the initial training, we heard one phrase again and again: restorative practice is great, but it doesn't work for these kids. There it was again, that baffling label. So I started to think more about who these kids really were. And as I was working in the education hub at GCC and alongside the staff in school, together we knew quite a bit about the profile of some of these kids. Many had complex backgrounds and difficult family lives, often with a family history of non-engagement and exclusion from school. There might be domestic violence or substance misuse in the home, sometimes criminal activity or antisocial behaviour, undiagnosed SEN and mental health issues affecting them or those around them. And then in 2008, I attended the first ACES conference. in Gloucestershire. I watched the film and I listened to the people talking about the devastating and long-term effects of ACEs, and it all started to make sense. These kids were experiencing trauma. They had experienced ACEs. Their brains and bodies were in constant alert mode and they were feeling toxic stress on a regular basis. They couldn't regulate their emotions and behaviours because their brains wouldn't let them. And it wasn't just the obvious traumas that were having such an adverse effect. In their recently published book, What Happened to You?, Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey talk about the cumulative effect of the small but persistent trauma experiences such as bullying or social isolation at school, and how these are just as damaging to our development as the more obvious big trauma events. However, there is hope. As my wonderful friend Juliet taught me, resilience trumps ACEs. Having a trusted adult in your life enables you to feel safe, and feeling safe and being able to talk through your experiences enables you to make sense of your emotions and builds your resilience. And I know now why restorative practice is such an important part of the puzzle. Because when we take time to build relationships and a sense of community and belonging, when we really listen to each other, try to understand each other's perspectives, triggers and behaviours, and when we practice using non-blaming language to repair the harm we cause each other, we can transform our trauma, our lives, and build our collective resilience. Since the first ACEs conference in 2018, Juliet and I, alongside a number of other practitioners and school leaders, have come to realise that all kids and adults can engage in restorative practice. However, in order for them to do so, we as the educators and role models need to better understand the impact of trauma and ACEs on their behaviour and mindset, so we can support them safely and enable them to thrive. Research into ACEs and trauma is informing our practice all the time. The original study in the late 1990s only included 10 ACEs, but we know now that there are many more to consider, including the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Adversity is merely the event, it's how we respond to it that causes the trauma, and this is different for us all. Many of us could have been labelled one of these kids growing up, but most of us had nurturing adults to guide us through our difficult experiences, adults who believed in us and who showed us that we were special. So I'm here today to talk about why we all need to be ACEs aware and trauma informed, and of the positive impact of restorative practice in schools, and indeed in all of our relationships. But I'm also here to ask you to think about which children and young people in your life would consider you to be their Maggie Edwards, their safe and trusted adult who nurtures them through the tough times, because we all need and deserve one. If a child doesn't have a safe adult, then that kid will become that adult, and the cycle begins again. Breaking that cycle is the responsibility of us all. Finally, I'm very proud to say that the same school whose staff room I found myself in all those years ago is now embarking on their journey into restorative practice with us. And this time, I know how to help those kids and the adults who support them. I will now hand over to our ACEs coordinator, Sam James, who will pick up our journey from her own personal perspective.
When I started on this journey some 20 years ago, I started a journey of trying to understand, working with and supporting people. I never thought it would lead me to where I am today. I never thought I could be so passionate about something, have something so ingrained in my values and principles that I ended up thinking about it even when I was not at work. I started off on this journey as a defence solicitor in criminal law, working in magistrates and Crown Court during my training. It led me to the questions of, what happened to the brain in times of stress? What led this person to end up sat opposite me in shackles? With this came a curiosity to understand the stories of my fellow humans. After a spell in law, and with a sense of the system I was working in being unfit for purpose, I completed a PGCE and started working with children, families and schools. This was my vocation. Fast forward 11 years, and with a mild understanding of restorative justice, would you believe that it was not taught in my law degree, I came to know of restorative practices as an approach, an ethos, a way of being. This sounded like it did what it said on the tin. Eager to find out more, I registered my interest in restorative practice training programme, and for the first time in a long time, I felt enthused about what I was about to be a part of. This is what I had been missing in all that work as a solicitor, in all my work in early help. This is what connected up the dots. It filled in the gaps I had been searching for. And encouraged by my new peers, I embarked on an intense one-year master's degree in psychology. And with this came the ability to investigate ACEs in more depth. Gaps in research meant that I concentrated on adults that had experienced ACEs as children, wanting to understand that if the number of ACEs someone had experienced affected their success in securing well-paid employment. My hypothesis being that, as you would think, for so many reasons, those with a higher ACEs count would secure less well-paid employment. All the research I looked into told me that this was the case. Everything I read told me that these kids will grow up to be these adults. But, spoiler alert, this did not happen. This was not the outcome of my research. My hypothesis was void and I was incorrect. I questioned myself time and time again, but I've read all the research. I should have been right. I like being right. Why aren't I right? And then I realised what I had truly uncovered. My curiosity reignited. It sparked the same curiosity from all those years ago as a fledgling solicitor. What was the story? If all these people had proved me wrong and proved the research wrong, the research I had spent hours reading, how had they done it? So I started speaking to people. I started understanding their stories. As children, the participants in my study had very often been labelled these kids. Well, they had proved they don't turn into these adults. What had happened? What had fostered their resilience to do so well out of situations so bad? Unanimously, those willing to give me more feedback than my original crunching of numbers all cried, "A safe person." Most often the term "a safe adult" was used. But what does a safe adult mean? Paul Dix talks about the concept of botheredness. Deliberate botheredness, says Paul Dix, is the small stuff, the asking how you are and actively listening to the answer, the acts of daily care, the perpetual generosity of spirit, the interest that you show in their lives. That is what matters most. Botheredness is deliberate, it is slow, it is gentle, kind and caring. What I had also forgotten, getting caught in a web of theory and research and numbers during my dissertation, was that the ACEs study was, as Dr. Bruce Perry so accurately describes it, a 50,000-foot flyover of someone's life. You are not getting into the weeds. You are not learning that much about them. When the ACEs study originally came out, it was largely ignored by the academic community. Over time, it started to connect the dots for people, like it did for me, and it started to shift a culture. What you are doing with ACEs is starting a journey into their story. ACEs made people talk. ACEs made people listen. And ACEs made people more aware of the behaviours exhibited by those around them being more than bad kids, than those kids. So what have all these stories really conveyed? That ordinary people like you or I, we can be safe adults for someone. My question for you to take away is, what can you do to be someone's safe adult today? I would now like to hand over to my colleague Juliet to talk about trauma-informed approaches, the last piece in the puzzle of being more informed around relationships and ACEs as individuals, but also as a community and a society.
Thanks, Sam. The first thing I want to say is that if you're listening to this behind your computer screen and you're living with the impact of ACEs in whatever way, then please know that you're not alone. I know that might sound cheesy or cliched, but it matters to me personally that no child, young person or adult with ACEs should ever feel alone. And the amazing thing about a day like today is that shared sense of empathy and compassion for the impact of ACEs and trauma on the lives of children. What Joe Tucci describes as our shared whale song. This is a song that is both deeply resonant and incredibly healing for all of us who have ever felt alone because of our experiences of adversity. And this whale song echoes far beyond what divides and separates us. The adverse childhood experiences studies have exposed that our schools, our communities, our homes are barbed with the arrows of adversity. And as a society, we are hemorrhaging from our wounds. These studies have rung true for many of us because for so long, the wound of trauma has gone unacknowledged. We have not realised the extent of adverse events prevalent in society at large, or recognised the pervasive impact of our early experiences upon our physiology and our psychology. The impact of ACEs such as abuse, neglect, or domestic violence on the development of an individual's neurobiology, their nervous system, body, and mind, cannot be underestimated. We let children down if we ignore at best or punish at worst these children for adaptations to their biological stress response system that they had no conscious control over. When working with a child, we may never know the source of the original arrow or adverse event. We may not even realise a trauma wound is there at all. Often, all we see are the dysfunctional behaviours that manifest as a result. But if we are not trauma-informed, these behaviours may not be recognised as originating from an adverse childhood experience. The hidden residue of trauma can be misconstrued or misinterpreted by adults around a young person. The behaviours are frequently viewed through a myopic behaviourist lens that deals only with observable behaviours, rather than understood in the wider human context as a distorted communication of an underlying unmet need, an emotional pain that is hidden from view. When we see an iceberg coming towards us, it's not the tip that we should be concerned about, but what lies beneath. Equally, what lies beneath a child's behaviour is where the focus of our attention and care needs to be. Bruce Perry says, troubled children are in some kind of pain, and pain makes people irritable, anxious, and aggressive. Only patient, loving, consistent care works. There are no short-term miracle cures. As a child growing up with my own ACEs, these were not realised. The signs of my trauma were not easy to recognise. I was frozen and fearful, distracted and distractible, anxious and perfectionist. But if my teachers had asked me why, I would not have been able to tell them. Trauma often lies beyond words. So, how do we begin to open the Pandora's box that an abused child brings to us, let alone find the hope that is also hiding there in the darkness? One wonderful teacher encouraged me into the arts, in writing stories and poems, often dark and horrific, and in painting pictures, often monstrous and terrifying. It felt like, for the first time in my life, a locked cellar door had been prized open in my mind, and I was finally released from my demons. Yet even this teacher had no idea what lay beneath the disturbing imagery, the core of my unspeakable pain. And when she left, the cellar door was closed shut. More often than not, the typical response to my misbehaviour in school was to make me sit on my own. And whilst the aim of this was to eradicate my unwanted behaviours and improve my academic attainment, it did nothing to address or honour the root cause of my behaviours. An inner wound that festered with the toxic shame experienced by many survivors of sexual abuse, which would only begin to heal many years later and still requires daily self-care. You may be thinking, well, why do we need to address this inner wound? Why not simply extinguish the unwanted behaviour? But the problem is, the behaviour never really goes away. While fear remains, while the emotions underneath the behaviour remain suppressed. The behaviour just shapeshifts into something else. And that something else could be something far more insidious than the original behaviour, like addictions, mental health issues, ill health, or crime. Many schools now realise that isolating, punishing, or even trying to reason with a dysregulated child rather than regulating them really just ricochets them from one survival state to another, one stress response to the next. For example, from fight to flight or fawn to freeze. It does not move them to a place of calm. In some cases, it can also result in re-traumatization. For example, showing zero tolerance towards a child with potential ACEs means being intolerant of a human being who is doing their best to survive abuse, neglect, violence, loss, conflict, or confusion, and communicating this in the only way they know how. If we are bleeding, then help us to heal. Do not hurt us even more. I spent years locked in a psychological prison of aloneness, lost in a labyrinth of lost words, holding onto hope like a candle, until someone somewhere saw my light and helped me to find my own way out. It has been said that adversity turns into trauma when we experience our mind as being alone, when we do not feel seen or heard, when we have no one to turn to in our distress. My own passion for promoting trauma-informed and relational approaches in schools comes from a wish to see every child in need have access to patient, loving, consistent care. This professional journey with Molly and others, as you now know, is a chapter in a much deeper personal story, a story that speaks of the importance of honouring vulnerability, or put simply, of being kind. Being trauma-informed, courageously reaching out to a child to meet their needs can be the difference between a life weighed down by risk and a life liberated through resilience. And as Molly and Sam have said, resilience requires relationships. Many children and young people struggle in school because they do not have experience of a secure base or safe haven to return to when life becomes unsettling, stressful, or scary. However, when young people feel nurtured and supported by one or more safe and trusted adults, they do not need to operate from a place of fear, so they can shed their armour and let go of any survival identities that no longer serve them. Ex-gang member Tito sums up, "Kids can walk around trouble if there is some place to walk to and someone to walk with." As my colleague James will now go on to discuss, as adversity and risk therefore need to be understood in the context of protective factors in the whole system, the whole school, and the whole community. Resilience is, after all, a mesh woven from many intertwining threads, not a single substance. Anne Maston concludes, resilience does not come from rare and special qualities, but from the everyday magic of the ordinary, normative human resources in the minds, brains, and bodies of children, in their families and relationships, and in their communities. I believe passionately that we need to view each other not only for our chips and cracks, but also for our tenacity to piece ourselves together again. Beyond our pain, we are more than our ACEs. Our trauma story is not our only story, and it does not have to be the end of our story. The dominant narrative needs always to be one of hope, strength, and resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet, for that personal and moving account of how unresolved trauma can impact on a young person. Hearing your explanation of how important a safe and trusted adult is takes me straight back to my 8-year-old self, a young boy who was coming to terms with parental separation, and whose behaviours at school would certainly have seen him labelled as one of those kids. My misbehaviour in school would regularly result in me being sent out of the classroom, for what now would surely be labelled as persistent and disruptive behaviour. While I didn't realise it at the time, Mrs. Hammond, the head teacher whose steps I would be sent to sit on, was my first safe and trusted adult. Her time, patience and consistency, although not necessarily the consistency I thought I wanted at the time, were working to repair the trauma that I was experiencing at that stage of my young life. The nurture and care she provided me with would become the foundations on which I was able to grow from as an older child into adulthood. While I was oblivious to this at the time, Mrs. Hammond ensured that I did not need to operate from a place of fear, but that I had a safe space to be able to express my thoughts and emotions without fear of further emotional harm or judgment. Juliet's reference to adversity being understood in the context of protective factors in the whole system segues seamlessly into the multi-agency model of work that I lead on across Gloucestershire. The team around the locality cluster, or TALC, is a collaborative and systematic approach across agencies, working in partnership with schools across the county. The overarching aim of the TALC is to support the unmet needs of our children and young people. The model is trauma-informed, ACEs-aware, and built on the principles of restorative practice, with a deliberate emphasis on the importance of communication as the foundations for trusting relationships. The model has its roots in the early intervention arena and is targeted at those young people who, for whatever reason, are experiencing barriers to education. These young people might include, but are certainly not limited to, those not consistently attending school, those not thriving in school, and those at risk of exclusion from school. In essence, TALC is placed to support those young people with emerging or existing vulnerabilities to be able to engage with education. For many young people that we work with, it's important not only from an academic perspective, but also from their emotional well-being perspective, as without access to the safety net of an education setting, many young people may not be given the opportunity to meet that safe and trusted adult, who has the potential to support a young person to build the resilience they require to achieve their potential. If we now think back to those kids that Molly eloquently discussed earlier in the keynote, what she described was the labelling and marginalising of a cohort of young people, a cohort who we would all consider as vulnerable. Now we know better than to label young people, we should acknowledge that it's not acceptable and never has been acceptable language. The associated negative connotations should be seen as unacceptable and damaging in our trauma-informed world. TALC brings together professionals and, more strategically, their agencies with the common goal of improving outcomes for young people and their wider family units. While the school subject of a referral is usually one individual, as soon as the discussion hits the multi-agency forum, the focus broadens to include all who live in that family home. By broadening the focus to include parents, siblings, and other key family members, the conversation and inquiry is able to explore the myriad of factors, many of which typically sit outside of the school gates, that are impacting on the behaviours and actions that the school initially brought to this forum's attention. So you will see the model truly is a systemic and holistic approach to supporting the whole family to build resilience. I've spoken a lot about multi-agency and collaboration. Perhaps no coincidence, given that my role is focused on bringing multi-agency and the multi-agency agenda to schools, and more specifically, inclusion within schools. I should therefore perhaps detail some of the agencies who are committed to the model so that you can see the breadth of interest and commitment across the county. Involved agencies include CAMS, School Nursing, GDAS and their young person delivery partner Street Gloucestershire, Gloucestershire Police, housing providers, family, children and family centres, alternative provision schools, Department of Work and Pensions, as well as internal Gloucestershire County Council teams from education, early help and social care. Not only do these agencies commit operationally, but they also commit senior leaders to provide strategic governance through the steering group. While evaluating the effectiveness of the TALC, I've spent many hours pondering over the data and profile of these young people who are referred. Overwhelmingly, the single biggest theme is that of young people with social, emotional and mental health needs. In fact, 90% of all referrals received during the pilot phase were identified by the referring professional as having SEMH needs. When digging a little deeper behind the data headlines, understanding the qualitative content of the referrals, perhaps more helpfully thought of as a child's lived experience, we see just how many ACEs and how much trauma many of these young people have experienced in their short lives. We shouldn't then be surprised when we start to explore the agencies who are asked to take the lead after the multi-agency meeting, and the interventions that are commissioned to support with these young people's needs. We note that CAMHS take twice as many actions as the next placed agency, and that the therapeutic and mentoring interventions are the most commonly commissioned services. All of this narrative points us back to the importance of first understanding and then repairing the harm caused by trauma that ensues after adverse childhood experiences occur. While we can and should all play our individual roles in supporting the unmet needs of young people across Gloucestershire, for some of us, this may even include being that trusted adult. TALC demonstrates that we should also be challenging ourselves to consider how we can work more collaboratively to share information and align resources to look beyond the behaviours, the facade that a young person all too often hides behind as a way of protecting themselves. My ambition is that we, and that's all of you here today, look beyond the presenting behaviours. In fact, we stop referencing misbehaviour altogether and move towards a culture whereby we look first at the unmet needs that sit behind and are driving the communication that a young person is choosing to share in the form of their actions. The culture change that I described there, just in case you missed it, is a culture of trauma-informed and ACEs-aware relational practice. Thank you. We'll now take some questions.
Okay, so thanks for your questions. I'm going to pick the first of those questions up. So with all of the restrictions still in place, I haven't got time to embed this into my school. How can these systems help me embed this into my everyday practice? Well, first of all, I want to start by saying I appreciate how busy schools and other agencies are at this time. It's the reality that young people are facing because of the pandemic. It's why we are all incredibly time poor at the moment. But I will say being trauma-informed and ACEs-aware doesn't need to be time-intensive. For me, it simply requires an open mind to consider those unmet needs that sit behind the actions and behaviours that young people are exhibiting. Looking through the trauma-informed relational practice lens, it's about getting to know that individual well enough to be able to identify those unmet needs that are acting as a barrier for those young people, not always educational needs. This is where TALC and its multi-agency response should be seen as a really valuable resource to look holistically and collaboratively at how some of those unmet needs can be supported to support those young people in Gloucestershire. So I'd say engaging will reduce the burden on you as a school. So full details on the TALC can be found on the Glos Families website. Just type TALC, T-A-L-C, into the search bar. And you'll also find some really useful resources on the Gloucestershire County Council website, searching for restorative practice or ACEs. I also want to, though, just mention briefly my role involving engaging clusters of schools. So under the Local Inclusion Network umbrella, the LINKS umbrella, we want to look at system-wide improvements that can be implemented, resulting in a more robust multi-agency inclusion agenda. So there's a real opportunity there for schools to inform the strategic direction that will impact on their everyday practice.
Cool, thanks James. Thank you all of you for your questions and for your lovely comments on our presentation. It's very much appreciated. We are very passionate about what we do in Gloucestershire, as you might have guessed. So I'm going to answer a couple of questions that have come up, one around kind of practicalities really, about if you're wanting to introduce a way of this way of working, where you begin. And I would say each school's journey or each organisation's journey is individual. It's never the same as anybody else's. So it will depend on what else you've put in place in your setting, where your start point is and what you want to achieve. The team in GCC are always happy to have a conversation first. So just email us at rpeducation@gloucestershire.gov.uk or give us a call. You can also find our details on the Gloucestershire County Council website just by typing in restorative practice. And you can gain a little bit more insight into what we're offering as a county. As a start point, I would say definitely start with circles. And if you can, start with circles for staff. This is about creating opportunities for people to come together in a structured and focused, supportive way to be able to discuss issues that are happening in school, situations that people are dealing with, and to create communities where we feel supported by one another and able to learn from each other's practice. There are a number of things we've learned, I guess, over the last 5 years of delivering restorative practice in Gloucestershire, one of which obviously we've talked about today, which is the need to be trauma informed and ACEs aware, so that we have an understanding of how people are engaging in a relational approach and why it's so important. I think the self-transformation is a big narrative. It has to start with self. We can't do restorative to other people if we aren't able to be restorative ourselves. We all work in a relational way in our team. We work in a relational way with other professionals, and we're always aware of trauma in our conversations and in our approaches. So I would start with yourself, start with looking at your setting and what things you can embed. You know, circles is the best place to start to just open up that dialogue and look at connection, reconnection, particularly for the school communities, and all of us as you know, we've all become peripatetic workers over the last year. We all need an opportunity to reconnect. And give us a call, get in touch, let us know how we can support you. Which brings me on to one of the other questions around whether there's free training for schools around ACEs aware, restorative practice and trauma informed. Yes and no would be my answer, not very helpful. Yes, there are elements of it that are free. I think if you're going to do it and you're going to commit to it and you want it to have the impact that it can have, and we know it can have, that's a long-term commitment, and that is ultimately going to take some investment on your part, whether that is staffing, whether that's resources, whether that's time, whether that is, you know, investing in a mentor or somebody to support you on the journey. Again, it's a conversation we can have. But yeah, absolutely, there is so much information out there around ACEs training, trauma-informed approaches, restorative practice, relational practice. Just get in touch with us and let us know what it is we can support you with. Okay.
Thanks, Molly. So I've seen a question come up and it says, it seems like this might take a lot of time and resources to apply this approach. Why is this a good approach? And I made a few notes down as I was kind of processing that question. There's lots of reasons why this is a good approach, but a few that I could think of were that it allows us to work as holistically as possible with the children and families of Gloucestershire. There's a massive growing body of research around why this is a really great approach, and although we haven't got time to go into it today, I am more than happy to talk about that outside this conference. Dan Siegel refers to the whole brain child, and I really like to think of this approach as like a whole brain approach. And as I mentioned in my talk, ACEs is a 50,000 foot flyover of what's going on in life. But when we combine it with that trauma-informed approach, attitude, and utilise a relational way to deliver that message, we get that whole brain working. so crucial. I think it's really important to see relational and restorative approaches as a conduit by which that message of trauma and ACEs awareness is sensibly delivered. We know that when we are talking about ACEs, that we can re-traumatise people. That has happened in the past, and we just have to be very sensitive about the way that we approach those. It's an opportunity to engage fully with that person's story. So we all shared our stories in our talk, and developing a trusting relationship is key to being able to share our stories. I think it's really crucial to think about that presentation of behaviours that we're seeing with those children and young people that we encounter every day should be seen as trauma adaptations and not pathologies. And also there's a recognised need across the whole of the country to increase the understanding and resilience and the impact that it has, and supporting those skills and knowledge, understanding the correlation between the outcomes. During the pandemic, I think the health inequalities were very much highlighted, and I think that the work that Mark Bellis has mentioned that he's doing, the research he's doing, is something that we should be looking into. Yes, there are definitely time and resources spent on this approach for sure, but as I said in the talk, if we can just start thinking about how to be more whole brain, and supports that process of viral change. As a council, and as Molly's already said, we offer guidance and are constantly developing training. We have a dedicated restorative practice team. We have an ACEs team to support everybody as much as we can. So although, yes, there are some resources invested, I think you'll find that the payback that you get from that is back 20-fold, if not more.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to pick up the question that was asked about how can I learn more about trauma-informed approaches for my setting. And I'd like to answer this question in two parts, if that's okay, by differentiating between trauma-specific and trauma-informed approaches. So firstly, with regard to trauma-specific approaches, recovery from trauma is often complex and can take time. So because trauma often results in a disconnection from yourself, among other things, recovery often requires specialist support or therapy to help you to recover your sense of self and to live with the memories or emotions of the past without being overwhelmed by them in the present. And with children, we need to take care to use developmentally appropriate trauma-specific approaches. Trauma-informed approaches, on the other hand, involve some really simple ways of being that have a profound impact on the life of a child. And these ways of being are very natural, things that we can all do. That everyday magic that Anne Maston talks about. And it's usually not the what, although that is important, but more the how. So how we respond to a child, the connection we make, the trust we build, the felt sense of safety we create, the empathy and acceptance we show them, and the co-regulation we provide. And we can use trauma-informed approaches like this every single day in our work, not as something else to do on top of what we're already doing, but just by thinking about the how. And I've included lots of resources on trauma and resilience on the conference resources page, but a good place to start in learning more about trauma-informed approaches might be to evaluate how nurturing your setting is as a whole. And one resource that I'd like to flag up in particular is Education Scotland's Applying Nurture as a Whole School Approach self-evaluation framework, which is a document that supports schools to implement key nurturing principles and to understand what nurture looks like, particularly in that context of the trusted adult. A nurturing approach recognises that children and young people will have had different experiences in their lives, and therefore require differentiated support from adults. And I talked just now about honouring vulnerability, and what I mean by that is recognising that some children need more. You know, vulnerable children already have the scales of resilience tipped against them. So in order to treat every child equally, we need to ensure that their experience of school is equal. And this requires that we give some children more, and that's not giving in to them, that's just giving them what they've missed out on or what they need, so that they're on a level footing with their peers. And when they're on a level footing, that means that they can grow and thrive as well as their peers. And when a young person feels that, when they feel that their vulnerabilities or needs have been acknowledged, but also that someone believes in them and believes in their strengths and talents and capabilities, then that's an incredibly powerful combination. So I hope that helps for now.
Questions, thank you very much. There's some really interesting ones coming through, and we will endeavour to get back to you and answer those questions at another time. But for now, thank you very much for listening to our presentation, and do get in touch with us at Gloucestershire County Council. Thank you.
Thank you.